Caddis Maximus here. This time we're reviewing Ridgid heavy-duty steel pipe cutters. Now, these are distinct from tubing cutters because tubing cutters tend to denote softer materials such as copper and aluminum tubing, where these are heavy-duty for cutting cast iron and steel pipe, stainless steel, etc. Although Ridgid has come out with a new version of these cutters specifically for difficult to cut materials like the various forms of stainless steel. How they upgraded, they simply replaced the wheels with ball bearings and then put a set of needle bearings in there. So obviously these would work, just may require a little bit more effort. And of course these, particularly with the wheels, you could upgrade the ball bearings. We have a nice comparison here. We have the 1 1/4 inch capacity, a 2 inch capacity, which is also a wide roll version, so we'll be able to take a look at that. And then of course up here we have a large 4 inch version, which is always nice, except for when you're actually having to lug it around because it weighs about 30 pounds. Also in this video I will be comparing to a Armstrong, and there's a surprising quality difference between these Armstrongs and Ridgids. Although you wouldn't expect it, because Armstrong, as many of my viewers know, has made some very high quality tools, but that particular 2 inch pipe cutter from Armstrong is just nothing compared to these Ridgids. Now, a lot of people will recognize the Ridgid brand from Home Depot and the orange tools, but there's a little bit of a story where Ridgid was, and I'm part of the time that they were selling out to TTI. These are owned by the same company that owns Milwaukee Tools. Home Depot wanted a house brand, and so Ridgid relicensed their name for their house brand tools, but everything that's sold at Home Depot, aside from some of these pipe cutters, aren't really related to the original Ridgid tubing and pipe threading company, which is where these originated from. And these have been for decades just really some of the best. And one of the big reasons for that, and we'll take a look at this wide roll, is that the whole body is actually forged steel. The main support here is also forged steel, and they're solid. There's nothing hollow about them. They're quite heavy duty. Actually, I'll lift up the lighter one here because that wide roll is actually pretty heavy. So as far as pipe and tubing cutters, they're actually very simple to use. You simply open them up, clamp them onto the pipe, not too hard, kind of softly, and then you give it usually a half twist, sometimes a full twist, and then you go around the pipe, and this sharp cutting wheel right here makes a slight notch into it, and it rolls on these two rollers. You'll want to keep these well oiled. And then each time you go around, you just give it a half turn, go around it again, and eventually you cut through the pipe. Now these are real standard because once this wheel starts making a cut, it makes it want to stay in that cut. As you're going around these outer wheels, actually any edge that starts to get raised up is actually flattened out by these wheels, which is quite nice. So the outside edge isn't sharp, and it gives you a very consistent and smooth cut. There is a little flange or a burr on the inside of the tube, and usually you have to use a reamer or something to get rid of that. But these do make nice smooth cuts, and they're very progressive, and they're very reliable. Due to the nature of you doing a cut, the cutting wheels tend to stay in pretty darn good condition. That's one of the things that you can look forward to, is having a nice, good, long life out of the cutting wheel, because it doesn't run over usually any kind of chips, it doesn't raise any chips, and once it starts cutting, the wheel itself is actually supported in the cut. And you can see, if we can get into the light, well, we'll look at the bigger one because it's easier to see, but these wheels are also very sharp, so you want to keep your fingers, they're not knife sharp, but quite close to it. Now, as far as looking at overall design properties of these Ridgids, besides having forged components, they have another number of distinct properties. One of them is they have a well-guarded wheel. They do have a cutout, so crud can easily fall out, or oil, and it is recommended that sometimes you do use oil, particularly on cast iron. Another property of them is that they have these pins which are captured between these little slots. So as you put pressure on them, there's no way that the pin is going to want to rotate inside the body and potentially wear out these forgings. They're also pretty easy to remove. They're lightly press fit, and sometimes they have like a little undercut and a little snap ring, and you'll just use a punch and like a socket, and you can punch them out and easily rebuild it. These are rebuildable. how you get them apart is you can see that there's a cutout and a notch in the beam, and you have to remove all 3 wheels. You have to remove the cutting wheel and the 2 guide wheels, and then you'll be able to screw this down far enough to actually lift it up off the body. Another nice thing about these Ridgids and why they've been so good is that they're pretty well machined. There isn't a lot, there's just a little bit of play that way, about enough for this type of a tool. You don't want it too tight because any type of crud or grit that gets in there will jam it up, but it's still very tight. And as far as wanting to rock back and forth, there's hardly any movement at all. And that makes for a nice cut. Other properties that they have is all the handles are knurled, so if you keep the threads well lubricated, and this needs better lubrication, it's really easy to spin it open and get it open wide if you're using a wide pipe and clamp it down small. And I thought that was quite innovative. Also, these aluminum handles are swaged or press fit onto the threaded rods, and they've always held up well for me. On this 4-inch one, it's a little bit loose, but that's a 30-pound tool, and just setting it down, lightly dropping it on the handle causes it to come loose, unlike this Armstrong. And we'll get to comparing to that in a minute. These are very simply labeled, such as this one is a Model 1. This is a number 202, because it's a wide roll, others be a number 2. This one's a number 4. So that makes it super easy. Now, as far as the wide roll, there's a couple different properties to the wide roll. One is the wider rollers, which makes it easier to use and more stable, particularly if you're using this where you're manually holding it, but you have a powered tubing machine where it rotates the tube and you're just holding this to cut it off. And you can see, as compared to a standard unit, the rolls are about twice as wide. The other nice aspect is they have these cutouts, and what these cutouts are for is if you had flared tubing, the flare could go into the cutout and then you would be able to cut off the end of the flared tubing very close to where the flare itself is. So if you're wondering why they have those cutouts, it's for those clearances. The other nice thing about the wide rolls is that they have a wider surface area, and so they actually roll more smoothly. There's just not as much pressure on them. And this is also a 2-inch version, so it does have a taller beam there. And then, of course, we have an older 4-inch version here. And this is a standard width roll. This thing is quite heavy. And the one difference that you'll find on the 4-inch version versus these others is oftentimes it requires a lot of force. When you're cutting, say, 4-inch pipe, it can easily have 1/4-inch thick or even thicker walls. So as this cutting wheel gets down into that cut, it does have more and more friction, and it can require quite a bit of effort. So this has a provision to install a second 5/8 pipe handle, an MPT pipe handle, to help give you some assistance using it two-handed. Otherwise, it's just a larger version of any of these other Ridgids, except for it's super heavy because of the size of the pipe that's designed to cut. What is interesting is even though it's made to cut much larger pipes, cutting pipe actually isn't the forces involved as far as the pins are concerned, there isn't a huge difference. And what's surprising is the pins on this 4-inch one are the very same size as the pins even on this 1 1/4-inch unit. And I always thought that was kind of interesting. It's just that the whole beam and everything's much heavier duty just to maintain rigidity of the tool, rather than worrying about shear forces on the pins. And of course, it's always nice to have a large cutter. Surprisingly handy when you're cutting PVC and you don't want to deal with deburring and saw cutting it. Now, to compare to the Armstrong, I've heard a few people complain about Ridgids, and they really are high quality. Ooh, I didn't quite show you a close-up. This 4-inch has been used quite a bit. And if I can get it in the light, you can see that the wheel itself is in still just excellent condition. Basically, you don't buy one of these if you see any chips at all in the wheel, period. The wheel needs to look, it can be dirty and have some particles, but there needs to be no chips or notches. That's really bad. As soon as you get a little chip or a notch, it will run over that notch when you're cutting the pipe. The pipe cutter will want to get stuck on it. The notch keeps growing each time you go around, and it's a real sad situation. Fortunately, the little cutting wheels are sold. I've seen them even sold at Home Depot. They're super cheap because it's just a small lathe piece of metal. And they're ridiculously easy to replace. You tap out one pin, swap the wheel, and tap the pin back in. And that literally is the only part about these that can wear out. Obviously, maybe if you use this millions of times, you might wear out the threads or something like that, or grind down the beam. Now, to compare to this Armstrong, this is indeed a nice Armstrong made in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and then I started discovering, kind of how Ridgid made their name with pipe tools, pipe threading, wrenches, that kind of stuff. And when I got this Armstrong, I was really happy with it, and then I learned actually how poor quality it is. This is actually, I would say, is similar to something you would find at Harbor Freight, and there is no question about it. One of the reasons is you can see just how much that beam wobbles. You can see how much it rocks back and forth. It's just so easy for me to do that. Going back to the Ridgid, like this wide roll, I mean, there's just almost no play. Just the tolerances are way better. Second off, we can see that the pins here are just swaged. They're permanently installed. You can never really, you would have to grind those off. They're slightly swaged. Technically, you could pound them out, and that's the issue, is you have to pound them out, and then when you reinsert them, you have to re-swage them a little bit. It just really wasn't designed to be very well rebuilt. The other issue with these pins is if you get some binding or forget to lubricate this or turn the handle too much and get too much pressure on it, the pins themselves wanted to start spinning, and you can see where that was an issue here, and somebody previous to me tried to fix it, but it's just wallowed out the hole. Really terrible situation. It's a big design flaw. It's one of the reasons Ridgid's pin the axles is so that they cannot rotate, or they're captured, so they cannot rotate. That can never happen to the body of the Ridgids. The other thing I noticed is I saw that there's this gap in there, and that didn't make sense. It seemed to be a little bit lighter weight, and it is hollow, and I thought, oh my god, this is not even forged. And yes, we can tell that because we can see the super thin line here, evidence of it being a two-piece casting, particularly because of the lost sand and it's hollow inside. And there's a big difference. Whenever something's forged, you always have a large kind of wide witness line as the metal is squashed and some of it gets squished out. Castings always have really tight, fine lines. So I was really disappointed about that. That is indeed a cast, not a forged piece of metal from Armstrong. There is no knurling. There is a little bit of knurling on the handle, but it's a far cry from the actual useful knurling that the Ridgids have. And then this has a steel handle, but you can see it's just terrible. It's just totally wallowed out and super loose. Really terrible quality. So it goes to show that even manufacturers of hand tools who you think really make good stuff, not everything they make really is the best. And as you collect more tools, you end up finding that, certain things like Ridgid pipe cutters really are some of the best. And then so on and so forth. Boss jigsaws, etc. And because I didn't want to do a bunch of different pipe cutter reviews, I'll go ahead and include, as a little bonus to the end of this video, smaller pipe cutters, such as the Superior Tool Pro line, which is kind of an interesting design. This has a nice little stop, although I'm not exactly sure what it's for. This would be great for brake line, small copper tubing, and it does have the little cutouts for flared tubing. And to make it more compact, instead of having a beam to guide the cutting wheel, it uses a square, and then the handle's just threaded into that. And these are always nice and handy. And these are all going to be similar types of tools. We have some really cheap ones like this, which don't even have rollers. It just slides on this V-groove, and the cutting wheel's in the body. But these are sold for, cutting brake lines and AC lines, simple things like that. We have the Napa KD version, which has a machined steel thumb wheel and screw integrated, but it is stamped sheet metal. It is a little bit floppy, which I don't like about it. And there isn't any cutout on the rollers for flared tubing. You just have to stick it in a little bit further. It does work well, but it seemed a bit expensive, and you can't really take it apart. It's all just permanently installed pins, which disappointed me a little bit. We have this Taiwanese, which I think is a it's like a Great Neck or an OEM brand or something along those lines, but I was actually surprised. This thing was pretty well thought out when it was made. It actually has a pretty heavy buckle. It uses a Phillips screw here and then press pins through the two rollers, so it can be taken apart and rebuilt if necessary. They use a little roll pin as a stop for the moving cutting wheel. So I thought there was actually a lot of different operations, and if we open this up, we can see that they indeed have the little cutouts for the flaring, like if you're going to be using these on brake lines. And as far as storing these, generally I leave them close to closed up. That way the wheel isn't really hanging out there, and that way some sockets or other tools can't bang into the wheel. But not so close that it's actually going to end up hitting the rollers and potentially damaging it. Now this is a... I can't even know. It's like a Carter, a Burt Carter, or something like that, T109. And this is the smallest, most compact version of a brake line cutter that I've seen. Now, it can't go around the line. You need to go over the top of the line. It's a little funky to use because you have this little thumb screw, and then you have to push the little cutter head back, like so. But what's nice is it's easy to replace the cutter head, and it's really, really, really narrow profile. So whenever the brake line is, say, close to something, I oftentimes find that even this little cutter is actually pretty easy to use, and I like its lightweight nature. And it's just interesting to compare some of these different designs and styles. Anyway, that was kind of my big long video reviewing and comparing these Ridgid industrial grade pipe cutters to various other brands and some small ones. Now I've looked around online. There's various other manufacturers. I saw some German ones which actually looked incredible. Ridgid's current pipe cutters are still just like these. They're really nicely made. But generally speaking, these are the ones that I've run into use because Ridgid's had such a big name in pipe threading. And really, they're pretty reliable. These are the kind of tool that you buy one of them, and that's all you ever need for the rest of your career, unless you lose it or significantly damage it. These do not like a lot of water. If these get covered in water and that kind of thing, try to blow them off and like spray some oil or drip some oil on them. If there's anything that really these don't like, is getting really rusty. And I've seen a few of them which would have been excellent. Ridgid actually makes a 6-inch version of one of these, and I really wanted it. It was this huge, like 50-pound hand pipe cutter, but it was so rusted that there's nothing. None of the wheels could turn. The screw threads were ruined, and I just had to pass it up. It was cheap, but it was just, you know, essentially unrecoverable. So I always like to mention that, because oftentimes you're having to use this to cut existing tubes which may have liquids in them, and don't just toss it in your toolbox and let it rust to beans. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe. Catus Maximus out.